Welcome back to the deep dive. This time, you've given us a real doozy.
Yeah.
A bunch of sources about how the Trump administration used tariffs on Colombian imports as leverage in immigration policy.
It really shows how, seemingly like distinct policy areas, how they can be totally intertwined.
And the potential for some unexpected consequences, for sure.
Yeah.
We are going to unpack this complex situation, but instead of like a timeline, we'll look at the potential effectiveness of the tactics used.
Right.
We'll examine the impact on both the Colombian and American economies.
Okay.
We'll dive into the reactions from various groups, and we'll try to understand what this all means for the future of U.S.-Colombia relations.
Got it.
First, though, deportation flights from the U.S. to Colombia.
Okay.
What's the story there?
Well, these flights are surprisingly frequent. And the reasons behind them are often really complex.
Oh, okay.
It's not always a simple case of like someone overstaying a visa or something like that.
Sometimes it involves individuals who have been living in the U.S. for years, even decades, and have, built families and lives here.
So you're saying someone could be contributing to society, raising a family, and still face deportation just because of their immigration status?
Exactly.
That's got to create so much anxiety for people. What happens to them when they're sent back to Colombia?
Yeah. It can be extremely difficult to reintegrate after being away for so long.
Yeah.
Many struggle to find work, reconnect with family that they may have been out of touch with, and then, of course, just cope with the emotional toll of being uprooted. And this is where the story gets even more complicated because the Trump administration seemingly wasn't satisfied with the rate of deportations to Colombia.
Right.
And they decided to use tariffs as a way to apply pressure.
Hold on. Tariffs?
Yeah.
Isn't that like an economic tool? How does that relate to immigration policy?
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about this case, right?
It demonstrates how seemingly separate policy areas can become, completely intertwined.
Yeah.
Trump's immigration policies, they were focused on reducing illegal immigration and increasing deportation. And he viewed tariffs as a lever to push other countries to comply with his agenda.
So these tariffs weren't just about trade.
Right.
They were about using economic leverage to influence immigration policy.
Yeah.
That feels like walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
Using one policy area to strong-arm another. What kind of products were targeted by these tariffs?
Okay.
And what was the intended effect?
The tariffs hit a wide range of Colombian goods.
Okay.
Including agricultural products like coffee and flowers.
Oh, wow.
Textiles and manufactured goods.
So pretty broad range.
Yeah. And these sectors were chosen strategically because they represented a significant portion of Colombia's exports to the U.S.
I see.
So the idea was to create economic pain that would force the Colombian government to cooperate on deportations.
So it's like a pressure tactic. Hit them where it hurts.
Right.
But wouldn't that also hurt American businesses and consumers who rely on those Colombian imports? Did anyone think about the unintended consequences?
That's a key question.
Yeah.
And the answer is complicated.
Yeah.
While the tariffs were designed to pressure Colombia, they also had ripple effects on the U.S. economy.
Of course.
American businesses that relied on importing Colombian goods face higher costs.
Right.
Which could lead to increased prices for consumers. Think about your morning coffee.
Oh, yeah.
If a significant portion of your coffee beans are coming from Colombia, those tariffs could mean you're paying more.
Okay, so everyone feels the pinch in some way.
Yeah.
But before we get into how those price hikes rippled through the system, let's zoom in on the American side for a moment. How did different groups within the U.S. react to this tariff strategy?
So the reactions, as you might expect, were divided along political lines. Republicans, who generally supported Trump's hardline stance on immigration, often saw the tariffs as a necessary measure.
Okay.
They argued that it was about time someone got tough on countries not doing enough to control immigration flows. Democrats, on the other hand, were much more critical.
Okay.
They argued that the tariffs were harmful to both economies.
Yeah.
And didn't address the root causes of immigration, like poverty and violence in Central America.
So it sounds like a classic political standoff, with each side digging in their heels.
Yeah, pretty much.
But what about groups outside of those partisan lines? Did anyone else weigh in on this situation?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Immigrant rights advocates were among the most vocal opponents of the tariffs.
Got it.
They saw them as inhumane.
Yeah.
And argued that they put vulnerable people at risk, potentially separating families and denying individuals due process.
Wow.
They also highlighted the fact that many of those facing deportations were contributing members of American society who posed no threat.
So a lot of strong opinions and ethical concerns swirling around these tariffs.
For sure.
But what about Colombia?
Yeah.
How did their government respond to this economic and political pressure from the U.S.?
Well, the Colombian government was in a real bind.
Okay.
On the one hand, they had to consider their economic interests.
Yeah.
These tariffs had the potential to seriously damage key sectors and cause widespread job losses.
Right.
On the other hand, they had to weigh the pressure from the U.S.,
Yeah.
a powerful ally with significant influence.
It seems like a no-win situation. What options did they even have?
Well, they did.
Was there a way to appease the U.S. without crippling their own economy?
They engaged in diplomatic efforts to try and resolve the issue,
Okay.
hoping to persuade the U.S. to reconsider the tariffs.
Right.
But they also explored countermeasures
Oh, interesting.
to protect their industries if negotiations failed.
Countermeasures, that sounds intriguing.
Yeah.
What were some of the options on the table?
So there were a few.
Did they threaten retaliatory tariffs of their own?
Retaliatory tariffs were certainly a possibility, but that carried the risk of escalating the situation into a full-blown trade war.
Yeah, I can see that.
They also explored seeking support from international organizations like the World Trade Organization,
Okay.
which has mechanisms for resolving trade disputes. And there was the option of trying to diversify their export markets to reduce their dependence on the U.S.
So it became a game of strategic chess, each side weighing their moves.
Yeah.
And trying to anticipate the other's actions. To understand the situation fully, we need to zoom out and consider the historical context of the U.S.-Colombia relationship.
Exactly.
I mean, their history is complex, marked by both cooperation and tension.
Right.
One event that looms large, of course, is the U.S. involvement in the Panama Canal separation from Colombia in the early 20th century, a historical wound that still resonates in Colombian memory.
Yeah.
Then there was the Colombian drug war, with the U.S. providing significant support to combat drug trafficking. And more recently, of course, there's the signing of the Colombia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement in 2012.
Right.
That free trade agreement was supposed to be a win-win for both countries,
Yeah.
boosting trade and strengthening ties. But how did it actually play out in practice? Were there downsides that might have contributed to the current situation?
Well, the free trade agreement led to a significant increase in trade between the U.S. and Colombia,
Okay.
particularly in sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and services. But it also faced criticism,
Oh.
with concerns raised about its impact on labor rights and environmental standards in Colombia,
Yeah.
as well as its effects on certain agricultural sectors. Some argued that the agreement primarily benefited large corporations,
Yeah.
while leaving small farmers and workers vulnerable.
So the trade relationship was already complicated even before these tariffs came into play.
Yeah.
It seems like there were both benefits and drawbacks to this closer economic integration,
Right.
planting the seeds for future tension.
Exactly. Free trade agreements often have these multifaceted impacts, creating winners and losers on both sides.
Yeah.
And when political tensions arise, like with these tariffs,
Yeah.
they can exacerbate existing inequalities and create new challenges.
We've set the stage and explored the historical context.
Okay.
But to understand the finer points of this situation,
Yeah,
we need to hear from experts who can really unpack the nuances.
for sure.
We've lined up some incredible guests for you. First, we'll hear from a trade expert who can delve into the intricacies of tariffs and their long-term implications, particularly the potential unintended consequences of using them as a political tool.
Okay.
It's a delicate balancing act with far-reaching effects.
Right.
And then we'll hear from a Colombian political analyst. They'll be able to provide a local perspective on how these tariffs might affect the domestic political landscape in Colombia. Their insights will be invaluable in understanding the full picture.
Yeah.
But before we get to them, we need to remember the human side of this story.
Absolutely.
We have some incredibly poignant personal stories from individuals affected by deportation. Stories that bring the human cost of these policy decisions into sharp focus. It's easy to get caught up in the economic and political debates.
Yeah?
But ultimately, real people's lives are being impacted.
For sure.
We'll also hear from Colombian immigrant communities in the U.S. about how these policies affect their lives.
Okay.
The fear and uncertainty they face and how they're responding.
Right.
These voices are essential in understanding how policy decisions ripple through communities, creating a sense of vulnerability and impacting social dynamics. This deep dive is already revealing how deeply intertwined trade and immigration policies can be, and the profound impact they have on individuals and entire nations.
It's a story that goes far beyond economic figures and political rhetoric. It's about the human stories at the heart of these policies and the ripple effects that reach across borders. It begs the question, what does the future hold for U.S. policy and its impact on Colombia and Latin America? Yeah, that really is the big question, isn't it?
It's like we're using this one event as a lens to kind of see all these, these patterns and connections that go way beyond just this single case.
Yeah, and to help us make sense of all that, we have Dr. Emily Garcia joining us today.
Oh, great.
She's a leading expert on trade.
Awesome.
And she can really help us unpack the complexities of tariffs and their impact.
Dr. Garcia, thanks so much for joining us. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. Thanks for having me. We've been exploring this situation with tariffs imposed on Colombia by the Trump administration. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia, seemingly linked to deportation policies. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. Right. From your perspective, what are the long-term consequences of using tariffs like this as a political tool? Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. Well, it's important to remember that tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods.
Right.
Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. So while they might be intended to protect domestic industries, expert speaker as Dr. Garcia, they often lead to retaliatory tariffs from the targeted country.
Right.
Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. And that can quickly spiral into a trade war that hurts everyone involved. So it's kind of like a dangerous game of chicken where each side is escalating. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. Hoping that the other one will back down first. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. Yeah, that's a good analogy. Okay. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. And in this specific case, the tariffs on Colombian goods not only impacted their economy, expert speaker as Dr. Garcia, but they also had ripple effects on American businesses and consumers. Of course, expert speaker is Dr. Garcia. You know those higher import costs get passed down the line. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. And suddenly your morning coffee costs a bit more.
Yeah.
Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. Or that bouquet of flowers for a special occasion becomes a luxury.
It really brings home how interconnected the global economy is.
It does, yeah.
A political decision made in Washington can end up affecting the price of coffee in a small town thousands of miles away.
And beyond the economic impact, what about the political fallout? Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. Sure. Does using tariffs in this way damage diplomatic relations? Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. Absolutely. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. It can erode trust between countries. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. Creating the sense that economic cooperation can be weaponized at any moment. Wow. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. And that makes future negotiations and agreements far more difficult, right? Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia, leading to a less stable and predictable global trade environment. So it's not just about the immediate economic pain, it's about the long-term damage to relationships. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia, exactly. And trust, expert speaker as Dr. Garcia, and in the case of Colombia, expert speaker as Dr. Garcia, this situation could push them to diversify their export markets. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia and reduce the reliance on the U.S. Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia, which, might seem like a positive outcome.
Right.
Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia. But it could also lead to political instability and complicate efforts to address shared challenges like drug trafficking and migration.
Yeah, it's a complex web of potential consequences.
For sure.
With both positive and negative outcomes in the mix.
Right.
Dr. Garcia, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Right.
Expert speaker as Dr. Garcia.
It was my pleasure.
We've gained a lot of insight into the intricacies of tariffs and their broader implications.
Yeah, and to get a deeper understanding of the Colombian perspective,
right,
we have Juan Carlos Torres joining us now. He's a prominent political analyst in Colombia.
Mr. Torres, welcome to the Deep Dive. Expert speaker as Juan Carlos Torres. Thank you for having me. We're particularly interested in your perspective on how these U.S. tariffs, expert speaker as Juan Carlos Torres, might affect the domestic political landscape in Colombia. Expert speaker as Juan Carlos Torres. Well, this situation has undoubtedly presented Colombia with a significant challenge. Okay, expert speaker as Juan Carlos Torres. The tariffs placed immense pressure on our economy. Right. Expert speaker as Juan Carlos Torres. particularly sectors like agriculture and manufacturing. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres, which are heavily reliant on exports to the U.S.
So it's not just an abstract economic concept, expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres.
Right.
It's impacting real people's livelihoods, causing job losses and financial hardship.
Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres.
Exactly, and this has led to a lot of frustration directed at the Colombian government.
I see.
Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. Some argue that they should have taken a stronger stance against the U.S. Okay. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. Perhaps implementing retaliatory tariffs or seeking international arbitration through the World Trade Organization.
So there's this sense that Colombia was kind of bullied by a more powerful nation.
Yeah.
And that their interests were not adequately protected. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. There's certainly that sentiment.
Okay. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. And it goes beyond the economic impacts. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. There's also a deep concern at the impact on Colombian communities in the U.S.
Yeah.
Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. With heightened fear of deportations.
Right. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres.
Yeah.
And further marginalization.
Those fears are understandable given the context. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. Yeah. It must be a deeply unsettling time for Colombian immigrants in the U.S. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. It is, and this situation has also fueled anti-U.S. sentiment in some quarters.
Oh, wow. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. Potentially damaging years of cooperation on issues like drug trafficking and security. So the ripple effects extend to the very fabric of the relationship between the two countries.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
Mr. Torres, given this complex backdrop, what are your thoughts on the potential long-term implications for Colombia? Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. Well, what path forward do you see? Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. Colombia is at a crossroads.
Okay, expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. This experience could be a catalyst for strengthening ties with other regional partners.
Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres.
Reducing
Reducing our dependence on the U.S.
Right.
Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. And creating a more diversified and resilient economy. Okay. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. But it could also lead to increased political instability and make it harder to tackle crucial domestic issues. It seems like the stakes are very high.
Yeah.
There's both the potential for positive change and the risk of things getting worse.
That's a really insightful observation.
Mr. Torres, thank you for giving us such a clear and nuanced understanding of the situation from the Colombian perspective. Expert speaker, as Juan Carlos Torres. It was my pleasure to be here. We've heard from experts who've provided valuable analysis and context.
Right.
But to truly grasp the human costs of these policies, we need to shift our focus to those directly affected.
Absolutely, you're right.
Let's delve into the personal stories of individuals whose lives have been upended by deportation.
Yeah.
One story that really struck me was that of Maria,
Go ahead.
a Colombian woman who had been living in the U.S. for over a decade. She had built a life in the U.S., working as a nurse's aide, raising her 2 American-born children. Imagine the trauma of being torn away from your family and everything you've worked for.
It's heartbreaking. And her story began with something as simple as a broken taillight.
Really?
She was pulled over, and because she was undocumented, she ended up being deported.
Wow.
It highlights the way seemingly minor infractions can have life-altering consequences in this environment.
It underscores the constant fear and uncertainty that undocumented immigrants live with,
Yeah,
never knowing when something as routine as a traffic stop could lead to deportation.
exactly. And Maria's story is just one among thousands.
Right.
Many Colombians face immense challenges upon their return.
Yeah.
Finding work, reintegrating into communities they may have left as children,
Right.
and coping with the emotional toll of being separated from loved ones.
It's a stark reminder that behind the political rhetoric and economic debates, there are real people with hopes, dreams, and families who are being deeply affected.
Let's also hear from Colombian immigrant communities in the U.S.
Okay.
They are living with the constant fear and uncertainty of potential deportations,
Yeah.
which has a chilling effect on their daily lives.
Our sources have highlighted how afraid people are to even leave their homes,
Right.
report crimes, or even seek medical attention for fear of being detained and deported.
Yeah.
It creates this sense of being trapped and silenced.
It also erodes trust in law enforcement and government institutions.
For sure.
People feel like They can't rely on the systems that are supposed to protect them.
But in the face of these challenges, it's also important to acknowledge the resilience and activism within these communities.
Absolutely.
You know, they are organizing, advocating for their rights, and supporting each other in remarkable ways.
Yeah, they're sharing information about their rights, providing legal aid, creating support networks to help each other navigate this difficult landscape.
It's inspiring to see how, even in the face of such adversity,
Yeah.
they're finding ways to fight for a more just and humane immigration system.
It's a testament to the human spirit.
Yeah.
The ability to find strength and solidarity in the face of injustice.
Right. This deep dive has revealed how deeply intertwined trade and immigration policies can be,
Yeah.
and the far-reaching consequences they have.
We've seen how economic decisions, political calculations, and human lives are interwoven in this complex web.
And the case of U.S. tariffs on Colombia demonstrates how seemingly disparate policy areas can become entangled with ripple effects that extend across borders and impact entire communities.
It raises crucial questions about the use of economic leverage in international relations.
For sure.
And the responsibility of governments to consider the human cost of their decisions.
This deep dive has taken us from the halls of government to the streets of communities impacted by deportation,
Right.
revealing the multifaceted nature of this issue.
And as we move toward the final part of this deep dive,
Okay.
we have a lot to reflect on.
What lessons can we learn from this case? How can we apply those lessons to future policy decisions to create a more just and equitable world?
Yeah, it feels like we've uncovered a lot of tough questions, but not a lot of easy answers.
Yeah, that's often the case with these complex issues, right?
But it's good, I think, to wrestle with them.
Yeah, definitely.
And we can all do our part to understand these things better.
For sure. And one question that keeps coming up is what the future holds for U.S. policy and its potential impact on Colombia and the wider Latin American region.
Yeah, that's something that came up in the sources a lot.
Right.
And it feels like we're at this turning point. Decisions made now could have lasting repercussions.
Yeah, for sure.
What trends do you see emerging in U.S. policy?
Okay.
And what might they mean for Colombia?
It's interesting. There's a growing recognition, at least in some circles, of the need for a more comprehensive and humane approach to immigration.
Okay.
There's a push for reform that addresses the root causes of migration.
Things like poverty, violence, and climate change.
That makes a lot of sense.
And there are calls for a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants already living in the U.S., as well as stronger protections for refugees and asylum seekers.
So that sounds encouraging, like a shift from just trying to keep people out to actually addressing the underlying issues.
Exactly. But there are also powerful countervailing forces pushing back against these ideas.
Of course.
Some advocate for stricter border control, reduced immigration levels, and a more enforcement-focused approach.
So it's like a tug of war between these different perspectives.
Yeah, it is.
And it's not just an internal U.S. debate, right? It plays out in how the U.S. interacts with countries like Colombia.
Exactly. Colombia, as a close ally and a major recipient of U.S. aid, is particularly susceptible to shifts in U.S. policy.
Oh, sure.
If the U.S. puts more pressure on Colombia to accept more deportees or to align its drug policies with U.S. priorities, it could really strain the relationship and create new friction points.
It really shows how interconnected these things are.
It does.
Decisions made in Washington can have a ripple effect throughout the region and beyond.
And we can't ignore the evolving geopolitical landscape in Latin America.
Of course.
Which further complicates the situation.
Right, so the U.S. can't just dictate terms anymore.
Yeah.
It has to navigate this much more complex web of relationships and interests.
Precisely. And that requires a deeper understanding of the region.
Yeah.
A willingness to listen to diverse perspectives and a commitment to finding solutions that benefit all parties involved.
This deep dive has been quite a journey.
It has.
We've explored the intricate connections between trade and immigration policies, delved into the historical and political context, and heard from experts and individuals directly affected by these issues.
It's been a fascinating exploration of the complexities of international relations, revealing how seemingly separate policy areas can become deeply entangled with profound consequences.
We've seen how economic decisions, political calculations, and human lives are interwoven in a way that challenges us to think critically about the impact of policies and the responsibility we all have in shaping a more just and equitable world.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you our listener with some food for thought.
What stood out to you most during our exploration?
Yeah, what aspects of the story surprised you
Yeah.
or made you think differently about these issues? We've only scratched the surface here.
There's always more to learn, right?
Yeah, always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, more questions to ask.
And it's a complex, evolving situation.
It is.
So this is just the beginning of your own deep dive
Right.
into this complex and evolving landscape.
We encourage you to continue exploring these issues,
Yeah.
engage in thoughtful conversations, and advocate for policies that align with your values.
It's important to remember that even seemingly distant political decisions can have a tangible impact on people's lives.
Your voice matters.
Yeah. Stay informed, stay engaged, and help shape a future where trade and immigration policies work for the benefit of all.
This has been The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep diving deeper.